We were alone in the basement, and what happened next left me speechless. The day had started like any other. I was just helping her with a few things around the house. Boxes to move, shelves to organize, the kind of mundane tasks that, somehow, felt different when I was with her. She greeted me with that calm, assured smile that always seemed to make the room feel warmer, despite the coolness of the late afternoon. I noticed the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed, subtle but telling, and I realized again why I always felt a little nervous around her. Not nervous in a bad way, it was more like being on the edge of something important, something I couldn't quite name yet. The basement door creaked open, releasing a rush of stale air mixed with the scent of old wood and dust. The dim light above flickered once, then steadied, casting soft shadows across the boxes stacked haphazardly in the corners. She gestured for me to follow, and I did, noticing the way her posture remained confident even as her fingers brushed against the rough surface of the wall for balance. We started moving boxes together, shifting the weight from one side to another, coordinating our movements almost instinctively. At one point, I reached for a box at the same time she did, and our hands collided. She froze for a moment, and I felt heat rush to my face. I quickly pulled back, embarrassed, but she simply smiled. A small, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. There was an unspoken acknowledgement in that fleeting contact, a subtle spark I couldn't ignore. As we worked, the basement seemed to shrink around us, the walls closing in just enough to make each brush of shoulders and accidental touch feel significant. I was hyper-aware of everything. The sound of her voice as she directed me to lift a heavier box, the soft rustle of her clothing as she moved, the faint scent she carried that was familiar yet impossible to define. Even the small sound of our footsteps echoing in the enclosed space seemed to carry more weight than it should. Then it happened. A sudden noise, a small crash as a stack of boxes wobbled precariously. She instinctively reached for support, and I was there, steadying her. Our hands brushed again, longer this time, and I couldn't help but notice the warmth of her skin. The basement, with all its shadows and dust, had suddenly transformed from a mundane workspace into something charged, intimate, almost cinematic. I found myself watching her more closely than I should, noticing the subtle way her brows furrowed in concentration, the quiet strength in her movements, the way she laughed softly when we finally stabilized the boxes. And she, I realized, was aware of me noticing. There was a brief glance, a fraction of a second where her eyes held mine a little longer than necessary. In that moment, the ordinary task of moving boxes became layered with tension, curiosity, and a faint thrill of closeness. Neither of us said much, words seemed almost unnecessary, but the air between us had changed. What began as a simple afternoon chore had already become something more, something I couldn't quite define yet. I knew one thing for certain. The basement was no longer just a basement, and I was no longer just helping her. The basement seemed smaller now, almost intentionally so. The boxes we were moving, once just obstacles to be handled, became silent witnesses to the quiet rhythm forming between us. Every step we took had to be measured. Every movement drew us closer, often closer than either of us realized or wanted to admit. There was a strange electricity in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the tasks at hand and everything to do with proximity, attention, and the subtle exchange of glances. I reached for a box just as she did, and our hands brushed again. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. The warmth of her hand against mine lingered, fleeting but unforgettable. I could feel the slight tremor of her fingers, maybe from surprise, maybe from something else entirely, and I had to remind myself to focus on the work. Yet even as I did, I found myself stealing glances at her. The curve of her neck as she leaned forward, the way her hair caught the dim light, the calm confidence she exuded even in the cramped, dusty space. Every detail seemed amplified, as though the basement had a way of magnifying her presence, making it impossible not to notice. We moved together in a strange synchrony, passing boxes, shifting shelves, stepping carefully around cluttered corners. At one point, our shoulders brushed as we turned simultaneously, and I felt an almost magnetic pull toward her, the kind that makes your heart skip without any explanation. She paused, perhaps sensing the intensity, perhaps enjoying it, and I caught a fleeting smile, a small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips that sent a shiver down my spine. In that instant, I realized that nothing in that basement felt ordinary anymore. The air between us was thick with unspoken acknowledgement, a silent understanding that we were both aware of the growing tension, yet neither wanted to name it. Her laughter broke the moment, a soft, warm sound that echoed in the basement and made the space feel lighter. I laughed too, more freely than I expected, noticing how easy it was to mirror her joy, how comforting it was to share even the smallest moments with her. I wanted to say something, to reach across the invisible line separating admiration from something more intimate, but words felt heavy, almost intrusive. Instead, I let my attention linger on small gestures, adjusting a sleeve, brushing off dust from a box, offering a steadying hand when she shifted her weight. Each act was ordinary in appearance but charged with subtle intention. The basement, once just a functional space, had become a stage for quiet intimacy. Every glance, every brush of skin, every shared laugh carried weight. I became aware of the scent she carried, the faint, warm perfume that blended with the mustiness of the basement, and it drew me closer even when I told myself to stay professional. Our voices were low, each word deliberate, each pause resonating in the confined space. I realized that this forced closeness was slowly dismantling the barriers I had carefully constructed around my feelings, replacing them with a cautious, thrilling anticipation. By the time we had maneuvered all the boxes into place, the basement felt transformed. It was no longer a dusty storage area but a vessel of subtle connection, a place where two people could be near each other and yet teeter on the edge of something unspoken. We weren't there yet. Nothing had changed overtly, but the foundation was laid. Every accidental touch, every glance held a promise, an undercurrent that neither of us could or wanted to ignore. By the time we paused to catch our breath, the basement had grown quieter, almost serene, in contrast to the flurry of movement that had filled it moments before. Boxes were stacked, shelves organized, and the immediate task was done. But the air between us had shifted in a way neither of us could ignore. The proximity that had been charged with tension now carried a weight of something softer, more intimate. Curiosity, trust, and the unspoken invitation to know each other beyond the confines of work. It was a stack of old boxes in the far corner that drew our attention next. One of them toppled slightly as I reached for it, and we bent to steady it together. Inside, we found a bundle of letters and photographs, yellowed with age, their edges fraying delicately. She picked up one carefully, her fingers brushing against mine, and for a moment, our hands lingered together over the fragile paper. I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers, not from the weight, but from something deeper, and I realized she was opening a part of herself to me. She began telling me about one of the photographs, a memory from her younger years, a story of ambition and misstep, of joy and regret intertwined. Her voice was soft, reflective, carrying a weight of experience I could almost feel. I listened, fascinated and empathetic, my heart tightening at the honesty in her tone. She wasn't performing or exaggerating. She was allowing herself to be seen, and the vulnerability in that act made the air between us electric. I responded gently, sharing a memory of my own, a small confession, something I rarely spoke of. The basement, dimly lit and enclosed, became our private world. My voice, normally cautious around her, felt unguarded here. We leaned slightly closer, drawn by the shared openness, the quiet understanding that had settled around us like a soft blanket. Each detail mattered. The way her eyes softened when I spoke, the subtle tilt of her head, the brief brush of her hand against mine as she set down the photograph. Time seemed to stretch. The basement, once just a functional space filled with shadows and dust, now held warmth. The sound of our laughter over a shared recollection echoed softly, mingling with the quiet hum of the house above. I was acutely aware of the contrast between her confident exterior and the gentle vulnerability she allowed in this private space. And she, I could tell, was aware of my attentiveness, of the care with which I handled her words and the objects she cherished. We didn't need to fill the silence with idle chatter. The pauses themselves carried meaning, the kind that doesn't require explanation. Every glance, every small gesture, a brush of a sleeve, the tilt of a shoulder, the momentary eye contact, spoke volumes. I realized that the basement was no longer just a backdrop for chores. It had become a space for connection, where two people could truly see each other, unguarded, in a way that was rare and fragile. By the time we finally straightened the last box, a subtle shift had occurred. There was a sense of trust, of understanding, and an almost tangible bond forming between us. The tension that had existed in the first moments of close quarters had softened into something more profound. A slow, deliberate intimacy that didn't need to rush, but promised that every moment together mattered. In that basement, among the dust and dim light, we were no longer just two people performing tasks. We were becoming witnesses to each other's lives. The basement had grown quiet again after our conversation about memories and past experiences. Boxes were stacked neatly, tools had been put away, and the dim light flickered softly above, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. For a moment, the mundane silence was almost comforting. But it was the kind of silence that amplifies the smallest sounds, the subtlest movements, and the faintest brush of skin. It happened unexpectedly. As she leaned down to pick up a fallen box, her foot slipped slightly on the cold concrete floor. Instinctively, I reached out to steady her, my hands brushing along her arms as she regained her balance. The contact was brief, yet the warmth of her skin pressed against mine lingered longer than I expected. I could feel the gentle strength of her, the subtle pulse of tension beneath her calm exterior, and it made my chest tighten in a way I didn't try to hide. She looked up at me, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. There was no embarrassment in her eyes, only a quiet acknowledgement of the closeness we now shared. The moment was fleeting, but in it, the boundaries of age, propriety, and hesitation felt suspended. For a second, the basement seemed to shrink even further, enclosing us in a bubble where nothing existed except this fragile, electrifying intimacy. As we returned the box to its place, our shoulders brushed again, this time with a softer, more deliberate contact. I noticed how she didn't pull away immediately. Her presence lingered, almost leaning toward mine as if she, too, was aware of the charged atmosphere. The warmth of her proximity was subtle but undeniable. It made my pulse race and left my mind caught between caution and curiosity. We both laughed softly at a minor misstep, her sleeve brushing against a shelf, a box wobbling dangerously, but the laughter carried a different weight now. It was a shared acknowledgement of closeness, a playful intimacy that neither of us could, or wanted to, name. I found myself lingering in her presence, aware of every shift in her posture, every glance, every subtle movement that drew me in. Her hair fell slightly across her face as she bent down again, and I almost reached out instinctively to brush it aside, stopping myself just in time. The basement, once just a place for chores, had transformed into a private stage where every touch and gesture carried unspoken meaning. The coolness of the concrete floor, the faint scent of dust mixed with her perfume, the warmth of her hand lingering near mine. All these details made the moment feel suspended in time. Neither of us spoke much, but the silence was laden with unvoiced emotions. Admiration, attraction, and the tentative recognition of something deeper forming between us. Finally, as we straightened the last few boxes, I realized that this was a turning point. The tension had shifted from accidental and fleeting to intentional and felt. The basement had revealed more than clutter and old keepsakes. It had revealed us, our hesitations, our unspoken desires, and our ability to connect through subtle gestures alone. In that quiet, dimly lit space, we weren't just two people sharing a task. We were two people discovering the electric intimacy of being near each other, moment by moment, touch by touch, without rushing, without needing to define it yet. By now, the basement felt almost like its own world, separate from the rest of the house. The earlier flurry of activity had settled into a comfortable quiet, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards above or the soft rustle of our movements among the boxes. In that stillness, the tension between us had shifted from fleeting touches and accidental brushes to something heavier, more tangible. An awareness that neither of us could ignore. We were sitting on opposite sides of a small stack of boxes, legs brushing occasionally as we shifted to reach for tools or to adjust our positions. The close quarters, the quiet, and the dim light created an intimacy that was impossible to deny. I felt the urge to say something, to express the strange mix of admiration, awe, and longing that had been building for hours. But words were difficult. They felt both inadequate and dangerously revealing. Finally, I spoke, my voice quieter than intended. I don't know why, but being here with you, it feels different. I can't tell if it's the basement, or the situation, or just you. The words felt clumsy, yet they were honest, and in that honesty, I sensed something shift. She looked at me, her eyes softening, not in judgment but in understanding. There was a pause, long enough for both of us to feel the weight of what had been said without filling it with forced explanation. She leaned slightly closer, just enough for our knees to touch, and let out a small, quiet laugh. "You're more observant than you realize," she said, her voice warm, measured, carrying both amusement and something unspoken. The sound of it made my chest tighten. I realized she was acknowledging my feelings without confirming or denying anything. A subtle reciprocity that made the moment electric. The air between us was thick with things left unsaid. Every glance lingered longer than it should. Every movement carried intention. I noticed the way she brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the soft tilt of her head, the calm confidence in her posture that belied a vulnerability I could sense but not fully name. It was an intimacy that didn't need words. Our presence, our attention to each other, was enough. For a brief moment, I considered reaching out, letting my hand brush hers intentionally, letting the contact speak louder than anything I could say. But I held back, respecting the unspoken line that separated admiration from something more. Instead, I let my gaze linger, soaking in the warmth of her expression, the subtle way her eyes tracked me as I moved or spoke. She returned the gesture, her glance soft and lingering, a silent acknowledgement that we were both aware of the growing connection between us. In that moment, I realized the basement was no longer just a place for chores. It had become a crucible for emotions, a private space where honesty, vulnerability, and desire could coexist without judgment. As we sat there, the world outside the basement faded away. I felt the thrill of emotional proximity, the quiet pull of romantic tension, and the comfort of being seen by someone I admired so deeply. Nothing was resolved yet, but everything had changed. In that quiet, dimly lit space, we had confessed in our own way, through words, glances, and lingering presence, that something significant had begun. By now, the basement felt almost like its own world, separate from the rest of the house. The earlier flurry of activity had settled into a comfortable quiet, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards above or the soft rustle of our movements among the boxes. In that stillness, the tension between us had shifted from fleeting touches and accidental brushes to something heavier, more tangible. An awareness that neither of us could ignore. We were sitting on opposite sides of a small stack of boxes, legs brushing occasionally as we shifted to reach for tools or to adjust our positions. The close quarters, the quiet, and the dim light created an intimacy that was impossible to deny. I felt the urge to say something, to express the strange mix of admiration, awe, and longing that had been building for hours. But words were difficult. They felt both inadequate and dangerously revealing. Finally, I spoke, my voice quieter than intended. I don't know why, but being here with you, it feels different. I can't tell if it's the basement, or the situation, or just you. The words felt clumsy, yet they were honest, and in that honesty, I sensed something shift. She looked at me, her eyes softening, not in judgment but in understanding. There was a pause, long enough for both of us to feel the weight of what had been said without filling it with forced explanation. She leaned slightly closer, just enough for our knees to touch, and let out a small, quiet laugh. "You're more observant than you realize," she said, her voice warm, measured, carrying both amusement and something unspoken. The sound of it made my chest tighten. I realized she was acknowledging my feelings without confirming or denying anything. A subtle reciprocity that made the moment electric. The air between us was thick with things left unsaid. Every glance lingered longer than it should. Every movement carried intention. I noticed the way she brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the soft tilt of her head, the calm confidence in her posture that belied a vulnerability I could sense but not fully name. It was an intimacy that didn't need words. Our presence, our attention to each other, was enough. For a brief moment, I considered reaching out, letting my hand brush hers intentionally, letting the contact speak louder than anything I could say. But I held back, respecting the unspoken line that separated admiration from something more. Instead, I let my gaze linger, soaking in the warmth of her expression, the subtle way her eyes tracked me as I moved or spoke. She returned the gesture, her glance soft and lingering, a silent acknowledgement that we were both aware of the growing connection between us. In that moment, I realized the basement was no longer just a place for chores. It had become a crucible for emotions, a private space where honesty, vulnerability, and desire could coexist without judgment. As we sat there, the world outside the basement faded away. I felt the thrill of emotional proximity, the quiet pull of romantic tension, and the comfort of being seen by someone I admired so deeply. Nothing was resolved yet, but everything had changed. In that quiet, dimly lit space, we had confessed in our own way, through words, glances, and lingering presence, that something significant had begun. If you want, I can expand Keynote 6 next, where the tension peaks and a choice, physical or emotional, is subtly acknowledged, leading toward the story's turning point. Do you want me to continue with that? You said, expand Keynote 6, 500 words. ChatGPT said, absolutely. Here's Keynote 6 expanded to 500 words, where the romantic tension peaks and the characters approach a subtle turning point. Keynote 6. The turning point, expanded. The basement had become a world unto itself. Shadows clung to the corners, dim light flickered overhead, and every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of paper, even the echo of our own breathing, seemed amplified. The air between us was thick, charged with anticipation. We were no longer just two people sharing a task. We were two people acutely aware of one another, each movement weighted with unspoken meaning. It started subtly. A box tipped slightly, threatening to fall. Instinctively, I moved closer to steady it, my hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away this time. Instead, our fingers lingered together for just a moment longer than necessary, long enough for our proximity to register deeper than either of us expected. The heat of her hand against mine, the brush of her shoulder, even the faint scent she carried. All of it made the basement feel like a separate, intimate world. We laughed softly, breaking the tension just enough to keep it from becoming overwhelming. Yet even in that laughter, there was a sense of gravity, a recognition that something had shifted irreversibly. Every glance she threw my way held a subtle question. Every smile hinted at awareness of the connection that had been quietly building. And I, for my part, felt a pull I couldn't deny. The urge to close the gap between us, to let my presence communicate the admiration and longing I had been holding back for hours. Then the turning point came. A sudden noise from above, a door opening or footsteps approaching, reminded us that we were still part of a larger world. My heart raced. For a fleeting moment, it felt like time had slowed. We were caught in a suspended second, teetering between restraint and surrender. Without a word, we both moved slightly closer, as if the silent acknowledgement of our feelings demanded a physical response. My hand brushed hers again, more deliberately this time, and I felt the warmth of her skin, the subtle tremor beneath her calm exterior. She looked up at me, her eyes holding mine with a quiet intensity that made my chest tighten. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. We both knew something had changed, something significant, even if neither of us was ready to name it aloud. It was a moment of shared understanding, a fragile yet powerful recognition of attraction, respect, and emotional connection all at once. As the external noise faded, we lingered in that closeness, aware of each other's presence in a way that was both thrilling and grounding. The basement, with its dim light, shadows, and quiet intimacy, had become a crucible for emotions, testing patience, self-restraint, and desire. And though nothing had been fully resolved, the boundary between admiration and something more had been crossed, subtly but undeniably. By the time we finally stood to straighten the last few boxes, I realized that this turning point was not a climax in the traditional sense. It was a moment of recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that everything had changed between us. The basement was no longer just a place for chores. It had become a space where our connection had deepened, a private world in which proximity, touch, and shared vulnerability had created something neither of us could ignore. We left the boxes in place, but the emotional weight of the moment lingered. Every brush of skin, every glance, every shared laugh had pushed us to a new understanding of each other, one that promised more closeness, more intimacy, and perhaps, if we allowed it, more romance. By the time we emerged from the basement, the house felt different, almost brighter. The dim, dusty, shadow-filled world where our emotions had been tested and quietly confessed was behind us, yet the weight of what had transpired lingered. Every step we took back into the main house carried the subtle hum of connection, the unspoken acknowledgement that something important had shifted between us. I noticed the small, ordinary details with new intensity. The way her hand brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the gentle curve of her smile when she caught me looking, the soft cadence of her voice as she remarked on how well the basement work had turned out. Each gesture felt amplified, as if the moments we had shared in close quarters had unlocked a heightened awareness of her presence. There was a pause as we reached the top of the basement stairs. We both lingered, neither wanting to break the fragile, electric tension that had built up over hours of shared labor and quiet intimacy. Our shoulders brushed once again, a deliberate, grounding contact, and I felt the warmth of her hand, subtle but undeniable. She looked up at me, her eyes soft but intense, carrying the weight of unspoken words. I realized then that words were almost unnecessary. The connection had been established in glances, in lingering touches, in the quiet vulnerability we had allowed each other to see. Yet, there was also the promise of more, of curiosity, of exploration, of a deeper understanding that could develop beyond the basement walls. She let out a quiet laugh, a soft sound that eased the tension and made the moment feel lighter. "You handled that better than I expected," she said, her voice teasing but warm. I smiled back, my gaze lingering on her just a fraction longer than necessary, and for a brief second, the world seemed to shrink to the two of us. As we finally moved toward the living room, our steps synchronized in a natural rhythm. I noticed how comfortable our closeness had become. There was no rush, no need to define what this meant immediately. The basement had been the catalyst, but the connection, the respect, the admiration, the attraction would extend beyond it. We were entering a new phase, one where feelings were acknowledged, and the potential for something deeper existed, yet patience and care would guide every step. Before parting ways, she reached out and gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. A small, deliberate gesture that conveyed warmth, approval, and perhaps a quiet invitation. I returned the gesture, my fingers brushing hers ever so slightly, and I realized how much those small acts of touch, accumulated over the past hours, had created a profound emotional bond. We exchanged one last lingering look, a shared understanding of the journey we had begun in that basement. There was a softness, a tenderness, and a quiet certainty that neither of us would forget these moments. Whatever the future held, whether it would be slow exploration, deepening friendship, or the beginnings of a romance, the impact of that day was undeniable. As we left the basement behind, the warmth of connection remained. The task had been completed, the boxes stacked, but the real achievement was something intangible. A bridge between two hearts, built slowly, gently, and with intention. And in that simple, quiet way, the story reached its conclusion. Not with grand declarations, but with the profound satisfaction of being seen, understood, and quietly changed by one another. If this slow burn story gave you chills or made your heart race, Hit that like button and subscribe for more unforgettable age gap romances. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a connection that took you by surprise? And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a story that makes your heart skip a beat.